Okay, it's my great pleasure to introduce Tom Weiss. I think you have a copy of his CV, his resume, so you know that there are productive academics and hyper-productive academics. A rare week or month doesn't go by without something that Tom has done coming by email or hard copy. I guess two big projects at the moment. One that I think is just out, Humanitarianism Contested, where angels fear to tread, and what he is talking about today, thinking about global governance, why people and ideas matter. Certainly Tom is a hybrid, lots of experience in the United Nations, back to Namibia, the ILO, UNITAR, and of course, extensive experience in think tanks, academia, now of course the presidential professor at SUNY and the director of the Ralph Bunche Institute, but with connections with ACUNS, certainly director for many years. And we got to add, given that we just come from Montreal, president of International Studies Association. But it's probably with all of this, probably what Tom is best remembered, certainly, and still remembered, of course, with present crises, R2P as the director of research for that. So certainly, I think, showing the mix of practical and intellectual concerns. Just to finish up, sort of going through the list, there's always sort of highlights that you remember books, not only looking forward to publications, but looking back to publications. The UN Intellectual Project, that again, I think Tom will be talking about today. Ahead of the Curve, I think, very notable. Going back to even the World Food Program and crisis of an earlier time in the mid-70s. And with that, showing that he can critique even the institutions he knows and loves, what's wrong with the UN, and I think with a caveat of how to fix it. So we're very delighted to have Tom today. He could talk about many things, but certainly today it's ideas and global governance.
Thanks, Andrew. Obviously, one of my two irreverent daughters would probably introduce me in another fashion. In fact, a number of years ago, when I was about to leave the house, as I do with some frequency, one of the younger ones was locked in her chamber, and I could hear this distinct voice with her little friend there. You know, I don't have a clue what he does, and I have no idea why anyone would pay him to say anything. I would pay him to keep quiet. So we'll see what happens today. The Intellectual History Project. This was actually, I'm going to talk a lot about these two books and what I learned from them and what I think this means for the future. One related to people, the oral history, and the other related to the ideas themselves. And at the end, I hope to illustrate why I think ideas matter by just taking the Millennium Development Goals and teasing out a little bit what I think they mean and why they've made a difference. I'm doing what graduate students are taught never to do, quote themselves. These are the last two sentences from actually the first book in the series, but it actually sums up the sort of themes we've been dealing with over the last 10 years. People matter, ideas matter. People matter because institutions, in spite of what people think about structures, they live and die or shrivel up and thrive by the quality of the people who are in them. Now, my late mother and other members of the general public, stimulated by the media, see traveling circus, talk shop, paper pushers, a little corruption mixed in. These images actually are not untrue some of the time, but they tell really only part of the story. And so what we've tried to do is look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. And similarly with ideas, institutions, in our view, live or die because of the quality of the policy ideas they come up with. So I'm going to spend just about a minute telling you how this got off the ground, because for those of you who are trying to think about organizing complex research projects, it doesn't get much more complex than this. This, as I say, 11 years, we had an advisory council like most projects, except this one actually worked. It wasn't just on the letterhead. Actually, 5 of the people there are in the oral history. 7 of them read at least 1 or 2 manuscripts. 2 of them actually read all of them. And 3 contributed to some of the books that were out of the series. This obviously wasn't cheap. And some combination of 8 governments and 7 foundations subsidized this. And what was interesting for me anyway, because this, even though the PowerPoint has a blue backdrop, doesn't have a blue tinge to it. This project was independent, and in fact, the only fight I ever had with the guys I co-directed the project with, Richard Jolly and Louis Emery, was how closely we ought to be associated with the United Nations. And I wanted a total separation, so there's no money in this from the UN itself. But what I found interesting about donors, for a change, was that they were not just interested in the last 5 minutes or 5 months or even 5 years. They were interested in slightly longer perspective. They didn't want just sound bites. They wanted something a little more serious. And I'm happy to report that as a result, a couple of other institutions have begun to correct the historical record. UNDP, good friend Craig Murphy, actually did an independent history published by Cambridge. UNESCO and ILO and a couple of others are now underway with their own projects. While I'm talking about 2 books, these next 2 slides deal with the footnotes for those 2 books. There were 17 volumes covering what we think are the big ideas, done by a whole variety of people, covering everything from regional perspectives, the development decades, political economy, gender, human security, human rights, the private sector, the environment. So, these books, which were all published by Indiana University Press, except for the Oxford Handbook, which is published by Oxford, lay out a complex picture that I'm going to try to summarize. Now, part of this theme is what we think the power of people, that people matter. This was, why was I interested in doing this? Well, because it seems to me that too much of what we write is in very abstract terms or thick description that doesn't account for people who are there. And one of the things that I learned after finishing a dissertation, when I thought that sort of bureaucracies and structures explained everything, is that in fact individuals do make a difference. And so this is an effort to tease out some stories, to provide some texture. It's also important to know that of the 80 people who were there, interviewed for between 2 and 14 or 15 hours each, for each hour of interviewing I did, I had somebody help me do about 20 hours of research to try to get into this. So I've corrected some memories. This is not just telling stories. The thing that is also important is that it's always actually too late to do an oral history. The UN itself has no institutional memory, not to put too fine a point on it, and most of these people actually don't pull together many pieces of this. There are a couple of exceptions. Stephen Lewis, for example, thinks that everything he writes is kind of funny and entertaining, so he wanted to do his own book, and Boutros did the same thing. But most of the people I interviewed actually thought that this was a way to put the record straight, and they weren't going to do it anyway. And for me, it's also important to give people like you and everywhere who, your main exposure to these institutions is the Globe and Mail, a website, op-eds, and the texture of what really goes on is important. And so while the image of dour diplomats and boring bureaucrats is not totally inaccurate, I think there is a different story to be told here. And that's what we've done. I brought along, actually, something else, which if they're, as I say, about 1 to 2% of the material is in this book, organized by theme, not by person. But the entire thing is on a CD-ROM, which actually is the first time an oral history collection has been put together this way. The UN Foundation actually paid for this, which means it's an electronically searchable book. So that if you're interested in knowing what anyone had to say about NGOs or what a particular person, Gambi Correa, had to say about preferential schemes or commodity schemes, you can find it instantly. And I have copies of these. So if any of you happens to be doing dissertation research for which any of these 80 people would be useful, I'd be happy to, or actually Joe has them in Jorge's office. So, who are these people? Half North, half South, about a quarter women, which probably overrepresents women, certainly in the early years and even until very recently. There are more economists than other kinds of folks because I started off looking at economic and social history, thinking that the political and security side had been treated much to a far greater extent. About a quarter of them were refugees, another quarter exiles of one sort or another. They have silver spoons in their mouths and are from very simple background. I'm just thinking of Bernard Chizero, who was the first black African head of a UN office, who actually was illiterate in southern Rhodesia, picking tea when he was sort of grabbed by a couple of Jesuits, put into a mission school. The next thing he knew, he was doing a PhD at McGill, which he finished at age 21. So the story of from 12 to 21 is really sensational. Anyway, one of the reasons that I did this also was that in an age of sort of nihilism and cynicism, these folks thought they were trying to do something, and I think there's some evidence that they did. So, an old television show used to say that people are funny, but I think they're also important. Well, this Secretary General, or at least his speechwriter, when he launched these two books, talks about the UN being a powerhouse of ideas. And this will be, in fact, the theme that I'm going to go to next. But I wanted to say, because I want you to keep these four notions in mind. Growing out of the oral history and growing out of all the other books, we tried to make an argument that ideas matter in four big ways, because the way we talk about ideas matters. The way we frame agendas, particularly when principles clash, is important. Ideas are used by different sizes of coalitions to pull, to lobby for certain kinds of issues. And finally, ideas become embedded, to use the jargon, in institutions. So, what this has meant over the years, and you can just think about this briefly, and I'm going to come back to it at the end, is that obviously if you're talking about bombs and bullets or human security, they're two very different things. If you're talking about bricks and mortar or wells drilled or girls' education, sort of development or human development, very different. Secondly, as I say, setting agendas when norms clash, something I've done a lot of work on, as Andy mentioned, responsibility to protect sovereignty or modest respect for human rights, or sustainability, the imperative to develop and the imperative to conserve resources. So ideas are a way to find some common ground between competing interests. And obviously, if you looked at anything from the women's movement to landmines, the criminal court, the way that different and unusual bed partners come together to mobilize for issues is a third use of ideas. And then finally, an institution can adapt, or a new institution be found. You say something like clout, when you put people and ideas together and put some resources behind them within an institution or adapt an institution, it makes a difference. Now, in thinking about these ideas, I'm just going to sort of illustrate with 4 or 5 quotes from people. This is Stefan Hessel, whom you may have read about recently. sold 2 million copies of a mimeographed document called Indignez-vous that was published in some publishing group, left-wing group in Paris recently. He also, for those of you who were Truffaut fans, was the offspring of the Ménage à Trois in the film Jules and Jim. He's an extraordinary guy who was also the UN ambassador in Geneva, New York, and was around with Henri Logier in 1947, working on the draft declaration of the human rights. And so, Stefan, it really is very strongly puts forward that first notion. It is really critically important how we talk about ideas, and the implementation may or may not come along very quickly. In terms of the human rights that he's talking about, if you think about the Commissioner for Human Rights, which was first proposed in 1947, if we had sort of evaluated that notion, this sort of operational idea, any time before 1993, you would have said, well, it's a flop, we didn't get there. But lo and behold, half a century later, it comes about. So it's important to talk about ideas and keep them on the front burner. Nolene Hazer, who's from Singapore, she's now the head of SCAP and was the former head of UNIFEM. She and I traded stories about surviving the Jesuits. But Nolene talks about the really critical importance of that second point. When people are trying to find a way to frame an agenda, make a difference. In her view, in the women's movement, the outside international standards of when the rubber hits the road and national groups take them up, they can move them ahead. The third idea, and because this, I don't want you to give the impression that they're only good news, obviously coalitions can come together for a variety of reasons, and Nafis Sadiq tells this wonderful story about the Vatican and Muslim countries getting together when she was talking about reproductive rights and her inability to get into certain loos without protection. So coalitions can come together for some of the wrong reasons. And similarly, and this is actually a major theme in the book, ideas can take on a life of their own. And Adebayo Adeji, who in fact was an academic and minister, head of ECA, and is now running an NGO on human rights in Nigeria, talks about institutions and ideas becoming like cemeteries. You can't get rid of them. So there's a rich texture in these interviews that I think substantiate, and I'm going to now move to the ideas themselves, why ideas are important. And the last quote I'm just going to put up, it shows why I had such a good time for 10 years. This comes from Lourdes Arizpe, who's an anthropologist who was a deputy head of UNESCO, and talks about the United Nations is no longer a dream managed by bureaucrats, but quite the opposite. It's becoming bureaucracy managed by dreamers. It's like being in power, I suppose, in Ottawa or anywhere else, with all the parties being in power at one time. And she talks about the importance of being a magician of ideas. So those are the four ways that I think ideas matter, that grows out of the oral history and finds its way into the second book, which is called The Power of Ideas, and the other substantive ideas that are in the book. As I mentioned, in this volume, people say, well, what do you mean exactly by UN ideas? I think it's important that there are three things to keep in mind as you speak about a UN idea. The first is that what we're really interested in is a value added. We're not arguing about who invented an idea. Margaret Anstey came up in a wonderful way with a nice alliterative way to describe the various roles that the UN, the value added that the UN does, which changes. Over time, it changes issue by issue. It may sometimes be a place that the idea springs up. It may sometimes be a place where you baptize it. It may be a place where you pull it together and discuss it. You may just sort of blow the horn and hope this makes sense. And one day you may need to bury the thing. So there are a variety of ways that the UN ideas matter, and we try to keep these distinct throughout the book. A second and very important factor to keep in mind is that obviously ideas don't stay unchanged over time. The original human rights idea, I mean, the Soviets with their gulags, the Brits with their colonies, the Americans with their black problem agreed to this universal declaration, which then, in a strange way, took on the life of its own. So we moved over time, I think it's really largely aspirational, to a form of implementation, far from perfect, but a change over time. Similarly, when one started out with the women's issue, it was really about eliminating discrimination rather than sort of thinking through the issue in a different way and moving toward empowerment. And obviously, peace and security, we have nothing like collective security, which was the original notion, but a whole lot of other efforts which we think are actually as important. And the third factor in the conversation, and obviously all of these are very large topics in the book, we talk about 3 UNs. Innisflaw always talked about 2 member states and secretariats who work for them. Our depiction of the second UN is that they're not just slaves of member states who pay the bills, that there's considerably more room for maneuver in the agency than we found in things. And then we have a separate group, which is we call the third UN, which consists of academics who are interested in it, NGOs who are following issues, commissions, a whole series of people who care about these issues and who push the first UN, who push the second UN. And at least in the realm of ideas, if you look at global ad hoc conferences or anything else, in that Venn diagram, it's that overlapping D, which is where the most sparks occur when these groups come together. I think that if I were doing this history again in another 10 years, there would have to be a fourth UN, which would be the private sector, which frankly has been absent from international discussions, certainly UN discussions. In the early years, and even until basically the late 80s, they were the bad guys. And now we may have gone overboard in trying to rope them in on every issue. But I suspect that in future history there will be a far more important fourth UN, which just actually is not part of this story. I'm obviously not going to go through these. These are our evaluation of the ideas that we believe, in a highfalutin way, say change the world. We do think these made a huge difference. We could read through those, and you can read through them. But the one I want to talk about today is the third one, which is the one that seems the mushiest in some ways. We know what human rights are, we know what equality is. But what is this idea about setting goals, and why is it a consequence? This is, in fact, in our view, a very underestimated part of the UN's intellectual contribution. It's been a singular achievement. When we looked at 50 big goals set over the last 65 years, it turns out actually that we're closer on many of these than we commonly think. And the one that's usually trumpeted where we get nowhere close is the 0.7 GDP assistance target, and that's for sure. We're nowhere near that. But on lots and lots of others, we've come a whole lot closer. I mean, if you go back to one of the first ones was eradicating malaria. We're clearly not there yet. We now have Bill Gates getting into the picture. But the idea of trying to take a topic, set up a goal, and move toward it is useful in several ways I'm going to talk about in relationship to the Millennium Development Goals. But the one that is just kind of fun to talk about is smallpox eradication, which we see as having provided an interesting model for what frequently happens. Schopenhauer once said that ideas or truth, there are three stages. First, something is ridiculed. Next, you fight against it tooth and nail. And finally, it seems self-evident. And the story of smallpox eradication actually looks like that. Here you have a disease that had been killing millions of people planet-wide for a very long time. In 1953, the head of the WHO had the audacity to say, why don't we try to do something about this? He was actually laughed out of the World Health Assembly. In particular, the Soviet Union said, said no, no way. And then 5 years later, in 1958, the Soviet Union actually came back to the plenary and said, maybe this is not such a bad idea. They got some better statistics on their own situation and said, so they changed. However, there was no money allocated in 1958, so we go another 1967 when finally the World Health Assembly allocated the princely sum of $100 million to be matched, more than matched, by host countries who were going to contribute $200 million. So we have a bill of $300 million, at the time the cost of 2 fighter planes. And if one fast forwards not very far, by 1970, there were 3 years of intense efforts to get rid of it. There were another 5 years of moving teams around anytime there was an outbreak. And really, by 1975, there were a handful of cases in Bangladesh, India, and Ethiopia. And by 1977, the last 2 cases, which were Ethiopian nomads in Somalia, were treated, and that was the end of it. So this story, we think, holds lots of lessons. And the setting of a target is an important part of that. The Millennium Development Goals. We have lots of photo ops, and everyone makes fun of them. So I just want you to keep the sort of Schopenhauer notion in your heads as we get rid of this photo and move to the Millennium Development Goals. I presume that you've encountered these in one way or another. Once again, this covers the development waterfront. 8 goals. There are 18 targets and 48 specific indicators of whether we're moving ahead. There have been a couple of reviews of these in moving toward the year 2015 when we were supposed to have managed to get there. My own evaluation is that the glass is about 75% full, that in the year 2015, there'll be lots of modifications. Obviously, putting China and India in the equation makes certain statistics a whole lot better, because the vast majority of poor people are in middle-income countries. The deadline for every single goal, objective, or target and objective on the same year obviously doesn't make much sense. What really got left out, in my view, in this whole business was the whole notion of growth, which actually sort of underlies development. So we've done all of these social indicators and forgot that at least, if not the only engine, at least one engine. And of course, goal number 8, the financing part has gone nowhere. I want to come back to those four ways that ideas matter, because I think if you just pull these apart a little bit, you can see why even goal setting and Millennium Development Goals, for which we're only part of the way there, make a difference. If you think about that first one, talking about ideas, why is this important? Well, if the Security Council decides to look at goal number 6 as AIDS as a security issue, the emphasis changes. If Bill Gates decides to move toward malaria, goal number 4, it is critically important in terms of moving the entire financing apparatus forward. Similarly, in trying to think about setting agendas, it's important in trying to balance children, girls' education. There are a whole series of issues that ministries struggle with all of the time in order to report on them. It's one of the few tools we have in sort of embarrassing states is to have them report on what's happening. And there are lots of trade-offs here that for which an emphasis on one of these ideas versus another is really quite important. Similarly, in terms of mobilization, both in 2000 and for the two reviews in 2005 and 2010, a whole series of actors in civil society, as well as like-minded partners in governments and in the UN secretariats, pulled together in interesting new ways, which we can go into in depth later. And then finally, institutions adapt because they're called on to report and do something. So that the entire UN system actually takes those 8 goals and the 18 targets and the 48 objectives seriously. This motley assortment of really decentralized agencies comes together around these issues in several important ways. And in addition, it's actually the only time that the World Bank and less so the IMF have actually gotten on the same page as the United Nations. So in our view, these 4 ideas matter, or these are the 4 ways that ideas matter. And I'd say that my own, I was talking to Jorge earlier about this, my own next research agenda is going to be looking into a 5th way that ideas matter that doesn't come out of this research, but I think is critically important, namely that when these mega norms from New York or Geneva or Paris or whatever, what happens in capitals with them? And so one of the things that I really want to do with the responsibility to protect is to see, to the extent that this makes a difference in Accra or Oslo, when a crisis comes up, and we've got a good couple brewing at present in both Libya and Côte d'Ivoire, and I want to see what happens to actors. Could be the media, could be NGOs, could be the government. What happens to these? So I think there will be, I'm persuaded that there is a 5th one. It's just that I haven't, that's not the research I've done to date. I'm going to wrap up here in a minute. I just wanted to point out that most people think that the best research and the best people are, at the World Bank, and they do pay much more. They have different recruitment policies, but I think it's actually of some consequence that there are 9 Nobel laureates in economics, since we were looking at economic and social development, who've been given the prize. So I usually have a quiz and say, well, how many worked at the World Bank? And usually someone will say, 0. And I say, no, actually there was 1. But that was Joe Stiglitz, who actually resigned from the World Bank because of his dispute over ideas and policies. If I were going to try to characterize the difference, why this makes a difference, the World Bank versus the UN, I think that the emphasis on fairness, the emphasis on national accompanied by international, the idea that you can set up targets and strive to reach them, and the notion that of the softest kind of development, whether it's water, women, children, education, these have all been characteristics of UN ideas. And so then one says, well, so what? It seems to me that the best piece of evidence for why ideas matter is if you take something called structural adjustment, which was justified only in terms of growth. And these figures, or from both the Emperor has no growth, tries to depict what happened in the 20 years before the Reagan, Thatcher, and Henry Kohl years, and the infatuation with structural adjustment and liberalization. And so you can see in Latin America, even though it wasn't great, there nonetheless was a substantial growth for 20 years versus an almost non-existent one. And in sub-Saharan Africa, of course, miserable goes to absolutely untenable. So we think it does make a difference where you come out on these issues. Whether you have structural adjustment or structural adjustment with a human face makes a huge difference. In the book, as I say, these are what we think are the assets of the UN in terms of putting ideas forward in the last 65 years. We trace these, and I'm happy to do any of them if you'd like. As I say, I just did that one. We also do a lot of negatives. These, in our view, are the biggest shortcomings. The fact that it took so long to go at the Washington Consensus. It wasn't until the late 80s, so sort of 7, 8, 9 years into this, that ECA and UNICEF began criticizing. It wasn't until really the mid-90s that there was any serious look at this. The poorest countries get shortchanged, we think, in analysis and in action. We haven't done much. UNESCO began a little work on culture, and then it dropped out. The scandalous sort of reaction to HIV/AIDS after the UN was actually at the forefront of this at one point. And the disparities in the gaps, so to speak, are the other huge shortcoming. There also are some perfectly awful ideas that didn't go very far. Julian Huxley, for instance, in 1947, had a research project on sex at high altitudes, which is sort of, even though we now have planes that go around the world, it still seemed a little bad. Along with the new international information, so there are lots of bad ideas in this book as well. But more or less, we think that the balance sheet shows a surplus. You can argue whether it's small or big. I tend to come out on a sort of modest surplus. My colleagues think it is larger. We also argue that in many ways, the UN has been in the lead on this. And the bottom line in the book is, frankly, that this has been one of the UN's singular contributions. We end up by saying, well, if you take this seriously, on the proposition, would it not make much more sense to focus attention on these areas? So we spent a lot of time looking at ways, because the UN is anything in many ways except a think tank. But there are pockets. And so we have lots of ideas here in terms of what kinds of people to recruit and promote. How do you create autonomy for researchers? If you think about the Human Development Report, when that first came out in 1990, there was a large hue and cry because governments had to clear all kinds of statistics and all kinds of recommendations. You couldn't do anything independently. And it's clear that that's just like a, hokum. That in fact, if you set up a unit, it comes up with some big and important findings and ideas, and you say, this is an intellectual island here. We pull the resources of the system together, you can make a difference. There are lots of ways of creating links with places like this one. We also think that something like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change could provide a model for other kinds of big issues. And we also think it's important to think about how the IFEs and the resources of the IFEs and the research of the IFEs might be put together with those of the UN. So, with that, I will leave the slide of the book up there and see if I've said anything that will have either irritated you or stimulated you to ask questions. So, thank you.
I don't think Tom needs any help on the questions. Lots of small things, but even more big things. So why don't we just go around? If we maybe just start
and maybe we'll take two or three.
Okay.
Can you ask two?
Someone close there.
why we think it's important. Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Well, let me start. Okay. One more. All very good questions. Actually, the quantifying the world one was the one I had most skepticism about. And here's where, leaning on a couple of colleagues who have different background than mine. And so, since they were both economists, and they're about 2 years older than I am, I had always worked with national accounts. And it turns out that, in fact, the UN Statistical Office was the origin of a series of national accounts. And so the idea of taking, for a good constructivist, what happens to the idea? What do you do with it? Well, the idea is that you have this norm, and it is used, and it spreads across every statistical office in the world, and is used to actually pull together data that we now all use to, it may be, bad data or decent data, but we're all working from the same sheet of music. And it turns out part of this story was also, very interestingly, trying to put a price tag on women's work in 1947. How do we do this? So there were a whole lot of things that, in fact, since, I actually would consider myself, I suppose, a constructivist. And Craig Murphy, who really has done a lot of work in this area, said, this is the best book in your series. It's the most specific. It's the best illustration of why pulling people together, mobilizing around a specific set of norms in this case, and getting it out and getting people to pay attention makes a difference. So it's really a really written by actually he was the chief statistician at the World Bank and at the UN, and he actually died recently. So anyway, it's a really interesting book. I think, well, I don't know, we can argue about the origins of ideas in the West or whatever. I think one would have to say in looking at these that a lot of them did come from Western blokes and scholars. But I'm not one who thinks that these don't have a far greater resonance. And in fact, somebody will do a really interesting study after the events in the Middle East, after the dust settles a little more, because the most important use of the Human Development Report and the indices that have been generated have come from the Arab world, in which these ideas, I suppose, whether or not it's access to drinking water, that seems a little universal to me, but maybe girls' education, but a whole series of indices were used globally, and then now we have national reports and regional reports. And the ones from the Arab world have ones that have made the most noise because independent scholars working for the UN have tried to say, well, what's happening in these local societies? And these have become major topics for debate within governments and outside of governments. So, I don't think that, well, there are lots of fora in which ideas are debated. And the UN would probably say that the regional economic commissions over the years have been one of the main ways to decentralize debates about regional characteristics. So the one that's been kind of the poorest is the one in the Middle East because it's bounced around from place to place, from war to war. But the other ones, if you trace, and one of the books in the series actually does trace economic and social ideas, economic commission by economic commission. And there have been some very interesting things that have come out, obviously from the Latin American context, starting with Ralph British and folks like that. And similarly, in the ECA context, in fact, the first work on women in detail in any region of the world grew out of Addis Ababa. Actually, an American woman, Peg Snyder, who started it, but it was approved by the ECA board and had a huge work program. So it seems to me that the texture of the UN is really very it's maddeningly complex. But there are bits and pieces of this that I think would help provide an answer to your question. I think that Alistair, on the responsibility to protect idea. As I say, this fifth way doesn't make a difference when in the field. I have lots of sort of anecdotes to suggest that that's probably the case. My feeling is that if you were looking at the Finnemore and Sickink model, that until recently we were somewhere in sort of the emergence getting toward a tipping point, it would have been hard to argue that most governments, most of the time, were all that familiar, wanted to use it. I actually do think that the Libyan, for as messy as it is, and obviously we don't know what's happening next, et cetera, but at least in terms of measuring how governments use a norm, if we go back and think it's been 10 years since it came out, it's a sort of breathless period. We've had ups and downs, backpedaling, and Father Brockman saying that we never agreed to anything. So there have been lots of contestation, but I would say that one has steadily moved towards something like a tipping point. And if you look at the debate on Libya, the first resolution, 1970, at the end of February, and the conversations that were going on, or at least the course of the conversations that I had that was going on, it's absolutely intriguing to think that within a couple of days, one had a resolution which, by UN standards, was breathless in its pace, agreeing to a whole series of Chapter 7 measures that, for instance, in Iran or any other place, we've taken years to get nowhere near, including travel bans, arms embargoes, asset freezes, and a reference to the International Criminal Court. That was agreed 15-0. I argued last night that in fact, I think the fact that military force, which had largely, people tried to forget about that as an element of R2P, prevention this and prevention that. It was sort of shying away from the sharp edge. The fact that military force was an item on the table made these other options seem immediately, I guess, more attractive. And then not even a week later, we have 1973 with the no-fly zone, the protection of civilians. And in between, interestingly enough, the Human Rights Council used the term for the first time in reference to Libya. And the General Assembly, for the first time in history, actually bounced a country from an elected position, namely Libya, off the Human Rights Council. So I don't know if we're at a tipping point. I don't know if the cascade is about to begin. But anyway, I think we're awfully closer now, and I suspect that we're going to slide back again. But that we're approaching a period in which, if you're using these notions, that I think R2P is advanced to that point. I think your first question. Think about that a while. It seems to me that almost, as I say, all of these ideas change, and that the adaptations in ideas, I haven't seen any sort of totally. There've been a lot of bad ideas. One I worked with, and it probably grew out of political correctness versus a good idea and a bad idea. It was something, the brain drain. And when I was working on economic issues from 75 to 85, the idea was that you should forbid people from moving around the world, or if you're going to get a Canadian passport, you give Delhi to pay for your absence. I mean, there were a whole lot of ideas about trying to constrain movements. There were also ideas about, containerization being a bad idea. Let's forbid containers because developing countries don't have cranes and ports to use containers. So the best thing to do is forbid containers. It seems to me those were pretty awful ideas. And they bounced off a series of, I suppose, market ideas that had been abused, had gone too far, there wasn't enough benefits, etc. But I don't see them as sort of countering a good idea. I see them as sort of growing up as a reaction to sort of bad results from partially good ideas or something like that. But I'm sure if I think about this, maybe I'll come up with another. Yes? He's a Canadian here only, no? No, just joking. That's all right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Actually, if you're interested in Cox, I'll give you the CD. He's one of the people I interviewed. And, I mean, there are very few people who spend, I guess it took him a retirement fund in 25 years to come to this conclusion. I gave him a hard time about this. I said, this hegemony didn't come up in 1947. It only came up in 1971. I mean, he worked for 25 years, and probably one of the more intriguing parts of the system. In the early years, anyway, it was called the Institute for Labor Studies, which is what he directed. I actually worked for him as an intern in 1968 or something like that. And so I've known him for a number of years. He, in our conversations, would argue that, as would Susan Strange, that international institutions are part of the hegemonic system, and these ideas get shoved down people's throats. And so when I said, well, okay, in the ILO, shortly after you left, why did basic needs get spawned by the ILO? This doesn't strike me as I mean, I suppose you could say keeping the people on the farm or something, but I mean, it strikes me that the whole notion of providing and measuring basic needs to human beings at the bottom of the economic ladder is anything except hegemonic. And he said, well, those were unusual guys. It was, the Dutch were funding it or something like that. And I said, but, institutions, I don't think, are only, mouthpieces for the existing order. And in fact, from my point of view, some of the worst moments in the UN have been the institution becoming a slave not to Western hegemonic ideas, but sort of cockamamie Southern ideas, of which there are just as many as Western ideas. And for years, the fact that you couldn't call into question the brain drain or trade with socialist countries or any of these ideas, or that necessarily this big block of Southern countries all being on the same page was a great idea. I mean, this is part of extant political correctness that I think has a lot to do with different kinds of hegemony, but not the one I think Bob was thinking about. So once again, maybe I'm saying it's a little more complex than that. But anyway, it's the one thing I remember him saying that was really terrific is that I actually think that outsiders make a huge difference in the UN, and that there ought to be more outsiders. And he said, well, when I was there, we would always hire consultants to say what we wanted to say. We just had to get somebody else on the outside to say it. But I can come up with a whole lot of other ideas of sort of unwanted ideas that have come up. And one of the proposals I was talking about, I think, and I've said this to him, so I'm not talking out of school. I think Francis Dane was a whole lot more effective when he was at Brookings and had $1 a year salary at the UN than as the Undersecretary General for the Prevention of Genocide, where he's totally useless. I mean, when he was at Brookings, the Dutch or the Carnegie or Ford or somebody gave him money, and you had to produce something. You had to occasionally irritate people. You had to bring out on a regular schedule things that pushed out the envelope. And actually, I wrote a book on this because I think he did on the internally displaced issue do several things that governments were furious about. He moves into the Secretariat, and that's kind of the end. So I would like to see far more Bob Coxes on the outside coming in, or Francis Danes on the outside coming in, than sitting on the inside, or at least a greater turnover. I think that's another real downside for a permanent international civil service, to have people there forever. You haven't had any recently, have you? No. Ideas. Yes, there was somebody else. Yes. That one's easier to answer because I'm not sure I have anything original to say about the sector. All I know is that when you're looking at worker remittances and private investment and thinking about that goal number 8 in financing, the Millennium Development Goals, there's no question that they've got to be involved. The question is how. And as I said, for years I worked in the UNCTAD Secretariat in the bomb-driven days of the mid-'70s, and transnational corporations were Barnett's overthrowing Chile, no use whatsoever. And it took about 20 years to get over that and to come to a position in which maybe they ought to be in the room. And then it actually was only in 2000, actually, with the Global Compact.
Can you link the two questions with John Ryan?
Oh, we got all these Canadian heroes. No, John was obviously part of that whole business, and he's still working as the special rep on, human rights and what have you. So I'm persuaded that there'll be a more significant presence. I'm not quite sure how. I mean, there's a kind of a structure for NGOs which was spelled out in the charter and has evolved in various ways over 65 years. There was, except for the ILO, there really isn't a kind of a seat at the table for the private sector. In and around the edges. But it seems to me that what will happen is that there will be at least a kind of a reflection like the sort of consultative status or something. But I also believe that there will probably be many more links on the research side and in terms of the reporting, everything from corporate social responsibility. You just don't want Oxfam to report on it. I suspect that there will be far greater corporate involvement in all of this. But that's sort of all speculation. I actually really don't know. That part of the third UN, and what I think is really intriguing, David, is the number of people in the interview pool who were only critics and sort of involved on the edges. Samir Amin, easily. There are lots of people, like I mentioned, Adedeji, who actually was a university professor of economics for 7 or 8 years guy like Jerry Heliner, who was actually only a professor, but every time you wanted somebody who had a modestly progressive thing to say and he needed a Canadian, you'd grab Jerry for an expert group or something. So there are people who come in regularly who are only academics, and there are people who were academics and become something else. And now there are a whole series of people who get recycled back. And in fact, I've been trying to get some students of sociology or anthropology to do this for a long time. I think that the sort of institutional cross-dressing is really an important and very new phenomenon for international institutions. You've got soldiers who become security advisors for UNHCR. You've got Julia Tapping, head of UNDP. Before that, she was head of the NGO circus in Washington. Before that, she was a native. I mean, you've got people who have been wearing several hats. And in terms of the academic ones, there has never been really a regular flow in and out. I actually, that's one of the things, way back when, one of the first things I tried to get launched in Aikens was to do this. Nobody wanted to finance it. There was then lots of UN officials wanted to get the hell out and have a 6-month sabbatical. But it was impossible to get a different traffic into secretariats. But actually, one of the proposals here is to do that kind of thing, to really have regular assignments for a limited period of time on particular kinds of research projects. If we're looking at, the ideas that were here, some of these, the origins come from NGOs, some of them come from commissions. There always is a kind of academic input into commissions. There's almost always an academic input into an issue like sustainability. When that issue got off the ground at FUNE, when Maurice Strong pulled together a bunch of people to get out of Geneva to try to break this logjam, there were several academics, or marginal academics or something, who were involved in those conversations. So I don't know how to qualify this, but I would like to see a better flow back and forth and a more structured flow back and forth. And that's why I think the IPCC model, where in one fell swoop you get 2,000 really world-class folks together on a particular topic and work on it for a sustained period with a small secretariat, that there'd be a lot of room for that kind of thing.
Could go on, but I know the students want to get sort of one-on-ones with
Oh,
you.
I see. Okay.
So I'll just ask Alice to come up and
say what a nice guy I am.
Say different things than your daughters.
Yes.
I've worked with Tom almost a decade now. I'm the executive director of the Academic Council of the UN. Tom was the former executive director, is now council on the board of directors. I've watched him do a lot of work from the outside. He is one of those people who makes an idea and makes that idea matter. He was one of the people that made the RTP idea matter. People are watching it. RTP matters in Liberia because Tom pushed the idea very hard. A lot of folks get the headlines for it. He's exceptionally knowledgeable at the UN. We're really lucky to have him down here to talk. He's going to be back again in June with Aikens. Aikens is having this promotional video for you. Aikens is having its annual meeting here at Wilfrid Laurier University and at CG on 2, 3, and 4 June. Tom is chairing the first panel session, Ideas That Matter, Government, Security, Development. We have senior UN people, former UN, current UN, senior and junior scholars participating in it. A vast number of people. Take a look at it. It's going to be a great chance. It's the only chance you get to attend an Aikens meeting here in Waterloo and probably in the foreseeable future in Canada, because it moves every year. folks like Tom will be back here for that. It's a really good chance to see people who put things into practice and who do know that it matters.